Picture the southern Kansas plains in the summer of 1873. The grass stretches flat to every horizon, the heat is punishing, and the smell hits you half a mile before you see the camp. Rotting hides, blood-soaked soil, and the sound of flies so thick they drown out the wind. This is not a hunting camp in any romantic sense. This is an industrial operation, and the men running it are about to help erase one of the largest animal populations on Earth in less than 2 decades. The question is not just what they did, it is what it cost everyone when they were done. To understand what the buffalo hunters walked into, you have to understand what the Great Plains actually was before they got there. Bison had roamed from the Appalachians to the Rockies and from central Canada down into northern Mexico for thousands of years. The herds shaped the land itself. Their grazing patterns, their wallowing, their seasonal migrations determined the grassland plant communities, the soil structure, and the habitat for dozens of other species. The Plains nations, the Lakota, Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Blackfeet, and others, had built entire civilizations around the buffalo. Food, shelter, clothing, tools, spiritual practice. The bison was not a resource. It was the foundation. The early buffalo trade in the first half of the 1800s was real, but limited. Traders wanted winter robes, thick hides with the hair still on, used back east as blankets and carriage covers. It was seasonal, geographically constrained, and the herds absorbed it. What changed everything was steel rail. When the Union Pacific completed the transcontinental line in 1869, and the Kansas Pacific drove into the heart of bison country around the same time, suddenly the frontier was connected to eastern markets in a way it had never been before. A hide shot in Kansas could be on a tannery floor in Pennsylvania within days. That single fact rewired the entire economics of the plains. Around 1871, tanneries in the East and in Europe cracked a process problem that had been holding the market back. They figured out how to turn raw buffalo hides into durable industrial leather, the kind used for heavy machinery belts in factories. Suddenly, the demand was not for winter robes. It was for any hide, any season, stripped clean. Almost overnight, the buffalo became a cash commodity on an industrial scale, and every man who could afford a heavy rifle and a wagon outfit started doing the math. The hide trade did not creep into the plains. It hit like a flood. A professional hide hunting outfit in the early 1870s looked nothing like what Hollywood put on screen. You had 1 or 2 primary shooters carrying heavy single-shot rifles, usually a Sharps chambered in .50 or .45 caliber, weapons that weighed upward of 12 pounds and could reach out several hundred yards with enough force to drop a bison cleanly. Behind the shooters came 2 to 6 skinners and camp hands, several wagons, a team of draft animals, and a cook. These outfits operated for months at a stretch out on open prairie, far from any town, resupplying at railhead boom towns like Dodge City or Hayes when the wagons were full. They called it a job. Most folks today would call it a death sentence. The shooting itself was built around a technique hunters called a stand. A skilled shooter would position himself downwind of a herd, identify the lead animal, and drop it from several hundred yards with a single shot. If he did it right, the other animals would mill around in confusion rather than bolt. He could work through an entire group methodically, one shot at a time, reloading and firing until the barrel overheated or the herd finally scattered. Hunters' own accounts claimed 50 to 100 kills in a good day, with some bragging of numbers twice that. Historians treat the highest figures as likely exaggerated, but even the conservative end of those numbers is staggering when you multiply it across thousands of hunters over a decade. The money looked good from a distance. Prime hides at the railhead in the early 1870s might bring $2 to $3 a piece at peak demand. A shooter dropping 50 animals a day could do the arithmetic in his head and like what he saw. But the reality for most men in the outfit was a different story. Skinners and camp hands were often paid a fraction of a dollar per hide, or a share of outfit profits that never materialized the way they expected. Many ended a season in debt to the outfitter or to the merchants at Dodge City who had fronted them supplies. The man at the top of the outfit made money. The men doing the brutal physical work of skinning in summer heat, hauling hides and managing draft animals often came out with almost nothing. Between 1872 and 1874 alone, historians reconstructing hide shipment tallies estimate that approximately 2.5 million bison were killed on the southern plains. That is not a number spread across a generation. That is 3 years. The southern herd which had seemed inexhaustible, was visibly collapsing by the mid-1870s. Hunters who had been working the same range for 2 seasons were already pushing further south and west looking for animals. The boomtown economy around Dodge City and Hayes ran hot during those years, saloons and outfitters doing heavy business, and almost nobody stopped to ask how long it could possibly last. The Plains nations understood exactly what was happening. By 1874, the hide hunters had pushed deep into the Texas Panhandle, territory that was supposed to be off limits under treaty. In June of that year, a group of roughly 28 buffalo hunters and camp followers holed up at a trading post called Adobe Walls were attacked by several hundred Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors, led in part by Quanah Parker. The warriors were not raiding for horses or glory. They were trying to stop the systematic destruction of the food source their nations depended on for survival. The hunters held Adobe Walls. The Red River War that followed ended with the Southern Plains tribes forced onto reservations. Nobody put that in the history books, and I think you know why. What happened to the Southern Plains tribes after the Red River War was not a coincidence or a side effect. Senior U.S. military commanders, including Generals William T. Sherman and Philip Sheridan, recognized openly in correspondence and speeches that destroying the bison meant destroying the independence of the Plains nations. The hide hunters were doing, with their Sharps rifles and their wagon outfits, what the Army could not accomplish cleanly on its own. Federal protection for the bison was debated. Texas legislators tried to pass a bill protecting bison cows with calves in 1874. It went nowhere. The policy alignment between the hide trade and military strategy was not accidental. It was deliberate. By roughly 1877, the southern herd was effectively gone. Hunters who had made real money in 1872 were now working harder for fewer animals across a much larger territory. The outfits packed up and moved north, following the last major concentrations of bison into Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming. The Northern Plains hunt ran hot from about 1877 through 1883. The same pattern repeated, the same boomtown economy, the same outfit structure, the same math, and the same ending. By 1883, the northern herd was gone too. The entire commercial buffalo hunting industry, from industrial launch to total collapse, had taken roughly 12 years on the southern plains and about 6 on the northern. The physical dangers of the job were constant and specific. Working in the open prairie for months meant exposure to weather that could kill you fast. A sudden plains blizzard in October could strand an outfit miles from any shelter, with temperatures dropping 40 degrees in hours. Summer heat and contaminated water sources meant dysentery was common in the camps. The skinning work itself was brutal, crouching over large animals with heavy knives for hours, in heat that accelerated decomposition, with flies covering everything. Accidental cuts from skinning knives were frequent, and infection on the frontier in the 1870s was not a minor problem. You would have quit by noon on day one, and honestly, so would I. William Cody, who became famous as Buffalo Bill, got his name hunting bison for the Kansas Pacific Railroad to feed construction crews in 1867 and 1868. He claimed to have killed 4,280 buffalo in 18 months, a figure historians treat as a blend of fact and frontier showmanship. Cody at least moved on to other things. Most of the men who worked the hide trade did not have his talent for self-promotion or his luck. When the herds were gone, the job simply ceased to exist. The outfitters closed up. The boom towns contracted. And the men who had spent their best years on the prairie found themselves with a specific set of skills that were now completely worthless. After the herds were gone, a new and even more desperate job emerged on the plains: bone picking. The prairie was littered with the bleached skeletons of millions of bison, and those bones had value as fertilizer and as raw material for bone china. Men and families fanned out across the grasslands, loading wagon after wagon with skulls and leg bones, hauling them to railheads and selling them by the pound for almost nothing. To make a living at it, you had to strip miles of country, working ground that had already been stripped of everything else. Entire trainloads of bison bones rolled east. It was the final accounting of the slaughter, and the men doing it were scraping the bottom of what the plains had left to offer. By 1889, the census of wild bison across all of North America came in at approximately 1,000 animals, Of those, only 325 were confirmed to be surviving in the wild in the United States. From an estimated 30 million animals to 325 wild survivors in roughly 2 decades. The ecological consequences ran deeper than the bison count alone. Bison had been a keystone grazer. Their removal, combined with the arrival of cattle ranching, the plowing of prairie sod, and the fencing of the open range, fundamentally transformed the plains ecosystem. The grassland plant communities that had evolved around bison grazing patterns began to change. The soil structure shifted. The stage was being set for crises that would arrive a generation later. Recovery came slowly, and only because a small group of people decided to act before the last animals were gone. In 1905, Theodore Roosevelt and naturalist William Hornaday helped form what became the American Bison Society, working to acquire rangeland and private herds to rebuild a viable population. A remnant herd in Yellowstone, a few animals held by ranchers and showmen, and scattered survivors in Canada formed the genetic foundation. Today, North American bison number in the several hundreds of thousands, but the vast majority live in private commercial herds raised for meat. Conservation herds managed for ecological and cultural purposes number only in the tens of thousands. The West was not won, it was just outlasted by whoever could take the punishment. The bison nearly did not outlast it at all. The buffalo hunters were not villains in the storybook sense. Most of them were broke men chasing the only cash opportunity the frontier was offering at that moment, working brutal conditions for wages that rarely matched the promise. But the job they did, driven by industrial demand, enabled by railroad infrastructure, and protected by deliberate federal policy, erased tens of millions of animals, shattered plains nations that had sustained themselves for generations, and permanently altered one of the largest ecosystems on the continent. The men who did the shooting were mostly gone and forgotten by 1890, broke or dead, or chasing some other marginal frontier work. The consequences of what they did are still being measured. That is what makes this job different from just about anything else in the history of the American frontier. If this is the kind of history you actually want, the jobs that were brutal and specific and real, the ones where the stakes were measurable and the consequences lasted longer than the men who caused them, then you are in the right place. Subscribe and hit the bell so you catch every episode. I have got more frontier jobs lined up that will make the buffalo hunter look like a desk position, and every single one of them is built on the same thing: real records, real numbers, and no mythology. I will see you in the next one. In the